I had $32 million sitting in 3 separate accounts, and my own son hadn't called me in 4 months. Not once. Not a birthday text. Not a holiday message. Nothing but silence from the boy I drove to every Little League practice from the time he was 6 years old until he decided, at age 14, that I was too embarrassing to be seen with in public. I kept my wealth hidden the way a surgeon keeps a scalpel hidden before an operation because timing is everything, and the moment you show your instrument too early, the patient runs. My son didn't know I was rich. He thought I was a retired city planner living on a pension and Social Security in a rental house in Garland, Texas. He thought I wore the same 3 pairs of slacks because I couldn't afford new ones. He thought my truck was a symbol of failure. He had no idea that the architectural firm I'd quietly built over 30 years and sold to a national developer in 2019 had made me one of the wealthiest men in the county. He had no idea that the rental house in Garland was one of 47 properties I owned across North Texas, under a holding company called Cole Meridian LLC. And he had absolutely no idea that the gleaming new office tower in uptown Dallas, where his financial guru held court, the building his wife called the most impressive address in the city, had my name on the deed. I didn't tell him any of that. I needed to see him clearly first. I needed to know who my son really was when he thought I had nothing left to offer him. What I found out was worse than anything I had imagined. And by the time I was finished, he would understand that the most dangerous man in any room is always the quiet one in the old truck. The invitation came on a Thursday. It was printed on thick cream paper with embossed gold lettering, the kind of stationery that costs more than most people's grocery bill. My son had slipped it under my door, not handed it to me personally. Slipped it sometime in the early morning when he knew I'd still be asleep. The card announced a private investment dinner hosted by Preston Hale of Hale Capital Group, black tie. Rooftop terrace of the Meridian Tower in uptown Dallas, Saturday evening. At the bottom, in my son's handwriting, "Dad, you should come. Dress nice if you can manage it." That phrase. If you can manage it. I set the card on my kitchen table and poured myself a cup of black coffee. I looked out at the yard. The grass needed cutting, but I let it grow long on purpose. It kept up the appearance of a man who couldn't quite stay on top of things. I drank my coffee slowly and thought about that sentence. If you can manage it. I had managed to design and construct 11 public buildings in the Dallas metropolitan area. I had managed to build a firm of 62 employees from a single drafting table in a studio apartment on Commerce Street. I had managed to negotiate a sale price that made my attorney laugh out loud when she saw the final number. But sure, I'd see what I could manage in terms of getting dressed. I called my attorney, Eleanor, that afternoon. She had been my legal counsel for 22 years and knew every inch of my financial life. I told her about the dinner. I told her about Preston Hale. She was quiet for a moment, typing something in the background. Then she said she knew the name. She said Hale Capital had filed 3 amended tax returns in the last 2 years and had no verifiable assets under management beyond a leased office space and a very expensive website. She said the man was running a confidence operation, and the only real asset he had was the ability to make desperate people believe he was connected to something bigger than himself. I asked her if my son had made any recent financial moves. She said she would check. An hour later, she called back. Her voice was careful. She said my son had taken out a personal loan of $60,000 3 weeks ago, using his car as collateral. I put my phone down on the table and sat in the quiet of my kitchen for a long time. The rooftop of Meridian Tower was everything Preston Hale needed it to be. The skyline of Dallas glittered in every direction, all glass and ambition and the particular kind of beauty that money builds when it's trying to impress itself. Round tables with white linens, string lights strung between heat lamps, waiters moving through the crowd with trays of things that cost $40 a bite. I arrived wearing my best church suit navy blue, purchased at a department store in 2018, a little wide in the shoulders now because I'd lost weight. I had parked my truck 2 blocks away and walked, which meant by the time I arrived, my shoes were dusty and my breath was slightly labored from the uphill grade. I looked like exactly what they expected me to be. My son spotted me from across the terrace. He was standing with a group of men in custom tuxedos, his wife on his arm, her dress so tight she moved in careful increments. He watched me approach, and I could see the calculation happening in his eyes, the rapid mental math of a man deciding whether to acknowledge his embarrassment or redirect attention before anyone noticed. He chose to intercept me before I could reach the group. He walked quickly to where I was standing near the elevator bank and lowered his voice to a murmur that was not a greeting. He told me I should have called ahead. He said he didn't know I was actually coming. He looked at my suit and then looked away. He said his wife's business associates were here, and he needed tonight to go smoothly. He said I should find a seat near the back and try not to engage anyone in conversation because the people here were, and he paused to choose the word carefully, a different caliber of professional than what I was used to. A different caliber. I looked at my son. He was wearing a watch I didn't recognize, a heavy silver thing on his wrist that caught the string lights. I recognized the brand from a magazine in a waiting room. It retailed for $4,000. I knew he hadn't owned it last Christmas because he'd asked me if I could help him cover his property taxes that year, and I'd quietly paid them through a third party so he'd never know it was me. The watch on his wrist was paid for with borrowed money. He was dressed in debt and lecturing me about caliber. I nodded. I told him I understood. I told him I'd stay out of the way. I found a seat at a high top near the bar, the kind of spot where catering staff rest their trays between passes. I ordered a club soda. I watched the room. Preston Hale was easy to identify. He was the gravitational center of every cluster of people on that terrace, a man in his early 60s with hair that had been colored just slightly too dark to be believable, wearing a tuxedo that fit him the way a tuxedo fits a man who owns several. He moved through the crowd the way a trained performer moves through a stage, never stopping too long, always leaving the previous conversation richer than he found it. He was good. I had encountered men like him in the development business my entire career. They were always good right up until they weren't. My daughter-in-law found me before the dinner program started. She materialized beside me with the specific energy of a woman who has decided to handle something unpleasant with maximum efficiency. She was smiling, but the smile didn't reach the part of her face that does the actual thinking. She told me sweetly that she was so glad I came, and then, without pausing, she turned to introduce me to a couple standing nearby. She gestured at me with a small sideways wave, the kind you use to indicate furniture. She said this was her father-in-law, that he had worked for the city in some capacity for many years, and that he loved coming to events like this, even though they were a little above what he was typically accustomed to. She said it the way people say things when they want the listener to understand the subtext without having to commit to it out loud. She said he was just so cute, still getting out and experiencing new things. Then she turned back to her conversation, and I was dismissed. I took a sip of my club soda. I looked out at the skyline. Somewhere in that skyline, on a clear day, you could see the older buildings I had designed, a county records office, a transit hub, a public library, with a glass atrium that a magazine had once photographed for a feature on civic architecture in the American South. The people at this party were standing on a rooftop of a building I owned, being served food on tables I was paying for through a triple net lease that deposited money into my account every single month, while my daughter-in-law explained to strangers that I was cute for still getting out of the house. I stayed through the dinner. I ate the food. I watched Preston Hale stand at the front of the assembled guests and deliver a presentation about a commercial real estate opportunity in the Fort Worth corridor that he claimed would return 200% within 18 months. I watched him use words like liquidity event and guaranteed yield and foundational investment tier. I watched my son sit in the third row, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, hanging on every syllable with the expression of a man who has decided to believe because the alternative is too frightening to consider. I watched my daughter-in-law squeeze his arm with pride. On the way out, Preston Hale introduced himself to me at the elevator. He had been working the room like a professional, and I was the last table. He shook my hand with the warm, rehearsed grip of a man who makes everyone feel like the most important person he's met all evening. He asked what I thought of the opportunity. I told him I thought the projected returns were creative. He laughed as if I'd complimented him. He said the old guard always took a little more convincing, but they came around eventually. He said my son had real vision and that I should be proud. I told him I was proud of my son for many things, Then the elevator arrived and I got in. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of my son across the terrace, watching me leave. He was not waving. He was watching the way you watch something that doesn't quite fit, that you can't categorize, that you're not sure what to do with. Good. Let him wonder. I called Eleanor the next morning before 7. I told her I needed to see every financial document connected to Hale Capital Group that was legally accessible. I told her I wanted to know who held the operating lease on the building, which I already knew because I held it through a management company called Starfield Properties that had no obvious connection to Cole Meridian, and I told her I wanted to know if my son had moved any additional money in the last week. She called me back at noon. My son had wired $62,000 to a Hale Capital investment account 2 days after the dinner. He had taken a second loan. He had borrowed against his $401k. He had emptied the joint savings account that he and his wife maintained for their daughter's college fund. I sat with that information for a full minute. His daughters were 11 and 8 years old. He had taken the money that was supposed to send them to college and handed it to a man who kept his office furniture on a month-to-month rental agreement. I told Eleanor to begin pulling the full Hale Capital file. I told her I wanted every complaint, every amended return, every LLC filing across every state where Preston Hale had operated in the last 15 years. I told her to reach out to the SEC's regional office in Fort Worth and ask what they knew. She paused and then said that she had already made that call 3 weeks ago, when my son's name first appeared on a Hale Capital investor intake form that had been obtained as part of a broader inquiry. She said the agency had been building a case for several months. She said the timeline for action was likely weeks, not months. I closed my eyes. I felt the familiar cold weight of a decision that has already been made settling into my chest. I told her to start drafting the paperwork to purchase my son's second mortgage from the lending institution. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would get it done by end of week. The package that arrived at my son's front door on a Tuesday afternoon contained one item: a formal notice of account review from the Texas Department of Securities regarding Hale Capital Group. It was a public document, available to anyone who knew to look for it. I had simply made sure he received a copy with a cover note from a law office that said only, "You should read this carefully before making any further commitments." I know he read it because his wife called me that evening. She didn't call to ask questions. She called to tell me that whatever I was trying to do was not going to work, that my son was a grown man who made his own financial decisions, and that my jealousy of Preston Hale's success was transparent and pathetic. She said Preston had already explained that regulators often harassed successful operators as a way of shaking them down for settlements. She said my son had more vision in one afternoon than I had accumulated in my entire career. She said if I had any real money or any real experience, I would recognize a legitimate opportunity when I saw one. She said they didn't need my negativity and they would appreciate it if I stayed out of their financial affairs going forward. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I said I understood. I said I would respect their decision. Then I hung up and drove to Eleanor's office and signed the mortgage transfer documents. Cole Meridian was now the holder of my son's home loan. The next 6 weeks I spent watching. My son posted photographs online of dinners at restaurants that required reservations made months in advance. His wife posted photographs of new handbags and a weekend trip to San Antonio. They were bleeding fast and spending faster, the way people do when they're terrified underneath and need the surface to look perfect. Preston Hale was feeding them monthly statements showing paper gains of 12%. My son was recruiting 3 people from his workplace into the investment. He was becoming a satellite of the machine. I drove past his house on a Sunday afternoon. It was a nice house in a good neighborhood in Frisco, 4 bedrooms, 2-car garage, a basketball hoop in the driveway that his oldest daughter still used. I sat in my truck and looked at it for a while. I thought about the Saturday mornings I had spent in that driveway with her, teaching her to dribble, her small hands slapping the ball off her own feet, and laughing until she couldn't breathe. I thought about whether my son had any idea what he had gambled away. Then I put the truck in gear and drove home. There was nothing left to decide. The only question now was timing. The SEC executed its warrant on a Wednesday morning. By noon, every business channel in North Texas had the footage. Federal agents in the lobby of the Meridian Tower, bankers' boxes stacked on carts, Preston Hale's personal assistant standing outside on the sidewalk holding her phone and looking like the floor had dropped out from under her. Preston himself was not in the building. He had been in Scottsdale since Monday, which the agents discovered when they checked the travel records. They found him at a hotel bar by 4 in the afternoon, wearing linen pants and a Panama hat, watching the coverage of his own arrest on the television above the bottles. My son called me at 6 that evening. He had not called in 4 months, and now he called twice in an hour. Both times going to voicemail because I was on the phone with Eleanor going through the response plan. I listened to both messages. His voice was not angry anymore. It was thin and hollow. The way a voice gets when something structural has collapsed inside the person using it. He said he needed to talk to me. He said things were complicated. He said he had made some mistakes and he needed advice from someone he trusted. Someone he trusted. I sat with that phrase for a moment. I called him back the next morning. We met at a coffee shop near his office, a corporate chain with hard chairs and music that was too loud. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in the back, his hands wrapped around a paper cup. He looked like he hadn't slept. He had lost some of the shine I had seen at the rooftop dinner. The expensive watch was gone from his wrist. He told me everything. He told me about the loans. He told me about the college fund. He told me about the 3 coworkers he had convinced to invest, 2 of whom had now called him threatening legal action. He told me his wife wasn't speaking to him. He told me that Preston had not returned a single message in 4 days. He told me he had done all of it because he wanted to prove something, though he trailed off before finishing the sentence. I let him talk. I did not fill the silence he left. When he was done, I asked him one question. I asked him what, specifically, he had been trying to prove. He looked at his hands. He said he wanted to show that he could provide for his family at a level I never had. He said he had grown up watching me work 60-hour weeks and come home tired, and that he had decided early that he would do better. He said Preston seemed like the path to that. I looked at my son. I thought about how to answer. I thought about the pension story and the rental house and the truck and all the years I had let him believe a version of me that wasn't entirely true, and I understood now that the story I had told with my silence had done damage I hadn't anticipated. He hadn't been trying to disrespect me. He had been running away from what he thought I represented. A life of exhausted sufficiency. Always, almost enough. He had run straight into the arms of a con man because the con man told him what he needed to hear. That didn't excuse what had happened, but it explained part of it. I told him I needed to show him something. I slid my phone across the table. On the screen was a document. It was the title deed for the Meridian Tower. His eyes moved down the page. His lips moved slightly as he read. He found the name of the owner. He looked up at me. I watched his face do the calculation. I told him that Cole Meridian LLC was mine. I told him I had owned the Meridian Tower for 11 years, which meant that every time Preston Hale held one of his dinners on that rooftop, he was doing it in my building. I told my son that I had purchased his second mortgage from the lending institution 6 weeks ago through the same holding company. I told him that I was technically his landlord, his mortgage holder, and the man he had told to stay out of his financial affairs. My son put the phone down on the table. He was very still. I told him there was more. I took out a second document, the quarterly statement from Cole Meridian's portfolio. I placed it in front of him and let him read the total asset value at the bottom. I watched his eyes widen. I watched the number register. He looked at me. He didn't look relieved. He looked devastated in a way that had nothing to do with money. He said, quietly, that he didn't understand. He said all these years, when he thought I was, and he stopped. I said the word for him. When he thought I was struggling, he nodded. His eyes were wet. I told him yes. I told him I had made a choice a long time ago to live simply and to keep my wealth private because I had watched money destroy other people's families and I didn't want it to destroy mine. I told him the irony was that hiding it had done its own kind of damage. I told him I was not blameless in how things had gotten to this point. Then I leaned forward. I told him that the damage was not undone by the explanation. I told him about the rooftop dinner. about his wife's introduction of me to her associates. I told him about the voice message in which his wife called my instincts jealousy and my experience worthless. I told him about the phone call she never knew I had answered and listened to in full, in which she told her mother that my son had traded up the moment he stopped pretending I mattered. I recited the exact words back to him, because I had never written them down. I didn't need to. They were the kind of words that leave a mark. He looked like he wanted the chair to absorb him. I told him I wasn't there to punish him. I told him I was there because 3 people at his office had potentially lost money because they trusted him, and that was not a problem I could fix, but that he needed to face and make right. Out of his own earnings, however long that took. I told him the college fund had to be restored. I told him the loans had to be paid. I told him that I was holding his mortgage and that I would not foreclose as long as he was making real progress, but that I was not going to pretend the paper didn't exist. He asked me what I wanted from him. I told him I didn't want anything from him that he wasn't ready to give genuinely. I told him that if he wanted a relationship with me, he could have one. But it would be between 2 honest people, not between the man I actually was and the version of me he had constructed to feel superior to. I told him the gardener was retired. He didn't laugh, but something in his face shifted, something that had been clenched for a long time. The enforcement action against Preston Hale moved quickly once the SEC had the full portfolio of complaints. There were 11 states represented in the investor list. The fraud had been running in some form for 8 years. Preston was denied bail on the grounds that he had 2 passports and a demonstrated pattern of relocating before proceedings concluded. He was held in Maricopa County while the federal indictment was being prepared. His attorney issued a statement suggesting he was a victim of regulatory overreach. The statement appeared to have been written by someone who had not read the financial documents. 3 weeks after my meeting with my son at the coffee shop, he called me on a Tuesday evening. He said his wife had asked him to ask me something. I waited. He said she wanted to know if I would come to his older daughter's basketball game on Saturday morning. I told him I would be there. I arrived early. I sat in the bleachers in my regular clothes, jeans, a plain shirt, the same kind of thing I had worn to every game of his when he was young. My granddaughter saw me from the court during warm-ups and sprinted over and wrapped both arms around my waist with the total unself-conscious force of an 11-year-old who has not yet learned to edit her affection. I held on to her for a moment longer than necessary. My son sat beside me in the bleachers. His wife sat on the other side of him. She did not acknowledge me directly for the first 20 minutes of the game. Then my granddaughter made a 3-pointer from a spot near the line that she had been working on all season, and everyone in the bleachers erupted. And in the noise and the movement, my daughter-in-law caught my eye accidentally, and I could see that she was trying to decide something. She looked away first, but a few minutes later she leaned across my son and said, quietly, that she wanted to apologize for what she had said on the phone. She said she had been wrong. She said the rest of it was going to take some time and she wasn't ready to pretend otherwise, but she wanted me to know she understood she owed me that. I nodded. I told her I appreciated it. I turned back to the game. My granddaughter scored 9 points that morning. She ran to me after the final buzzer with her hair falling out of its ponytail and asked if I had seen the 3-pointer. I told her I had seen every single second of it. She beamed. That evening I drove back to the house in Garland. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and looked out at the yard where the grass still needed cutting. Eleanor had sent me the week's Coal Meridian report. Everything was in order. The mortgage on my son's house was current. The first payment made on time without any conversation needed. The Meridian Tower lease renewal was proceeding. The scholarship fund I had been building quietly under the foundation had approved its newest cohort, 7 architecture students at UT Arlington. All of them first generation, all of them with the specific hunger in their personal statements that tells you the work is going to mean something. I thought about a conversation I'd had with Eleanor years ago, when I was first deciding how to structure the holding company. She had asked me why I wanted to keep it so quiet, why I didn't take the recognition that came with that level of accomplishment. I had told her that I'd watched recognition change people. I had told her that I'd watched men become the story they told about themselves rather than the thing they actually built. I had told her that I wanted the work to be the thing, not the performance of the work. She had said that was admirable and slightly impractical. I had told her it was both. I poured the rest of the coffee down the sink. I turned off the kitchen light. I thought about my son sitting in the bleachers that morning watching his daughter play. The good, honest tiredness of a man beginning the slow work of paying back what he'd taken, not with a check, but with the actual daily grinding effort of accountability. I thought it was the first real thing I had seen him do in years. I thought there was something worth building on in that, if both of us were patient enough to try. I don't have a lesson for you wrapped in a bow. I don't believe life organizes itself that neatly. What I can tell you is what I learned at 67 years old, sitting in a folding chair in a middle school gymnasium, watching a child who carries my name play the game I taught her father to love when he was small enough to believe I was invincible. Money is not the point. It never was. The point is what you do with the quiet years when no one is watching the decisions you make when the audience is gone and the bill comes due and you are sitting alone with the truth of who you actually are. My son chose badly for a while. He chose flash over foundation. He chose a borrowed dream over the patient work of building something real. But he is 38 years old and the ground is still under his feet and I am still here. And that means the story is not finished. I am not a forgiving man by nature. I am a patient one. There is a difference that matters. Forgiveness is a door you open once, and hope. Patience is the practice of staying in the room long enough to find out what's on the other side of the door. I am willing to stay in the room. I have stayed in harder rooms than this one and walked out the other side with something worth keeping. That is not nothing. At 67 years old, I have learned that not nothing is often the best any of us can reasonably expect from the people we love. And some mornings, when the light is right and your granddaughter scores a three-pointer from the spot she's been working on all season, not nothing turns out to be more than enough.